Valeria is one of the most beloved characters in the series. She's an expert swordsman who served under General Kwanda Rosman in the Imperial Army, and she received training under the legendary swordsman Radiance in Kanukan, where she developed a rivalry with Anita. If you're hoping this video explores Valeria's rivalry with Anita or their training under Radiance and how they got their Falcon runes, unfortunately it doesn't. That story was nothing more than a short 4 to 5 line paragraph in the encyclopedias and the Genso Shinso Volume 9 magazine, which doesn't really provide any details whatsoever. This video will be covering the events of a short story titled The Star Sword's Radiance, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 2, a book that released in Japan in May 2001. This short story covers Valeria's quest for revenge, how she came to train under a legendary swordsman and attain the Star Sword, as well as how she came to serve in Kwanda Rosman's army. The legendary swordsman I'm referencing here is not Radiance, so she's actually trained under two different legendary swordsmen. The story takes place in the Great Forest region of the Scarlet Moon Empire around the solar years 444 to 446, in the lead up to the War of Succession when Valeria was 13 to 15 years old. The story begins with Valeria standing in a clearing between the kobold and elven villages with an axe in one hand and a machete at her waist. It was known as the Eastern Clearing, and Valeria had been going there every day for the past 10 days, patiently waiting from dawn to dusk. As the sun began to set, Valeria muttered to herself, "I guess you didn't want to show up today either, huh?" Valeria decided to return home for the night, as according to the rumours, what she was waiting for didn't travel by night. On her way home, she gathered some wood and stopped by the house of an old man named Minos. Minos was a charcoal maker and a good friend of Valeria's family. He often traded them charcoal, eggs and smoked meat in exchange for the wood he needed to make charcoal. Valeria returned to her village, which consisted of 50 or so houses deep in the forest of Moran. Valeria and her family lived in poverty in an old building in the corner of the village. Valeria was welcomed home by her two younger siblings, her 9-year-old brother Cain and her 7-year-old sister May. Cain had been sorting the firewood he gathered, and May showed Valeria a chunk of cheese she was gifted by a neighbour who helped milk a cow in the Great Forest village. They had also been gifted a small jar of honey when some villagers found a beehive while foraging in the forest. As was tradition in the village, anything gained from communal labour was divided up amongst the villagers. As the three sat around the dinner table, Cain helped himself to a rather generous serving of the honey, which he smeared all over some rye bread. He then asked Valeria if she'd been to the Eastern Clearing recently, stating that his friends saw her hanging around there. May looked on anxiously as Valeria responded that she hadn't been there and that his friend must be mistaken. Cain believed her and changed the subject, asking about old Minos's cat, but May interrupted him, and in a worried voice she told Valeria that she's afraid and begged her not to do anything stupid as their mother died in that clearing. Valeria gently rubbed May's back and reassured her that she won't get hurt. The next day, Valeria once again returned to the clearing. She was trying her best to conceal herself in the grass by laying down so as not to scare away the wildlife. Suddenly, all the noise stopped and there were no signs of life in the surrounding area, as if everything had been scared away. Valeria thought, "This is it." She then stood up and spotted a one-tusked gold boar with a scar on its back. It was unmistakable. This was the very boar that killed her mother the previous summer. Gold boars normally resided in the west of the empire, but around a year ago, rumours began to spread of gold boars attacking people in the Great Forest region in the eastern side of the empire. This particular boar showed a great hatred of humans and had attacked and killed multiple villagers over the last year. The story then cuts back into the past to Valeria's father. Valeria's father was from the royal capital of Gregminster, but he was stationed at Panu Yakuta Castle when he joined the Imperial Army. However, he soon retired from the military and decided to live a peaceful life as a farmer when he fell in love with the beauty of the Great Forest. He died of illness when Valeria was just 9 years old. After his death, Valeria's mother spent all of her time working as Valeria watched her younger siblings. They lived in poverty, barely scraping by, but as Valeria got older, she was able to start working, which eased the burden on her mother, and her family were starting to live comfortably. Valeria had just begun joining the village's communal work a year ago, but she fell ill on the day she was supposed to join them in the Eastern Clearing, and her mother took her place. That day, a wild gold boar appeared and began attacking the villagers. None of the villagers escaped without injury, and Valeria's mother was killed while trying to run away. The villagers carried her body back to the village on a stretcher, and Valeria was in shock at the sight of her mother's body covered in blood. Valeria was filled with regret for allowing her mother to take her place at the clearing that day. She refused to cry at her mother's funeral as her younger siblings now had to rely on her to raise them, and she felt she couldn't do that if they saw her cry. Even though she never showed it, Valeria's heart was broken and filled with hate for the gold boar that killed her mother. After that day, the gold boar often appeared around the outskirts of the village, attacking any villager that got too close. The eastern clearing was now closed off due to frequent sightings of the gold boar. The villagers eventually formed a militia to hunt the boar down, but they had no weapons except for their farming tools and were easily defeated by the boar. After this, the villagers all chipped in what potch they could spare and set a bounty on the boar. Many hunters attempted to claim the bounty, but none were successful. Valeria was growing more and more frustrated that no one was capable of slaying her mother's killer. She then swore an oath in front of her parents' grave, vowing to take the boar's life herself and avenge her mother. One night after her brother and sister fell asleep, Valeria began searching the house for weapons, but all she could find were an old machete and a woodcutting axe. She picked up the axe, but the weight made her sway unsteadily and lose her balance. She knew there was no way she could defeat the boar unless she could wield the axe properly. From that day on, Valeria accompanied the lumberjacks into the great forest, where she learned how to use the machete to cut branches and how to properly hold the axe to cut down a tree. At first, the axe was so heavy she could barely wield it, and even cut her own hand. The village chief was concerned about her working in the forest with men and advised her not to, but Valeria couldn't be deterred. Over the course of the next year, Valeria had grown much stronger thanks to the work she had been doing with the lumberjacks, and she was now able to freely wield the axe without being hindered by its weight. Feeling prepared, Valeria would now begin visiting the eastern clearing in the hopes of encountering the gold boar. The story then cuts back to the current time where Valeria encounters the boar. The boar hadn't yet spotted Valeria and was digging through the weeds in search of food. Valeria leapt out in front of the boar and her sudden appearance startled it. Valeria swung her axe, driving it into the boar's shoulder. The boar made a loud squeal as it fell to the ground with blood flowing out of its wound. Valeria wondered to herself if she had finally avenged her mother, but a few moments later the boar stood up and started staring at her menacingly before lowering its head. Valeria had heard stories from the villagers that wild boars often lowered their heads before charging and that they could only charge in a straight line. Valeria managed to dodge the boar's charge, but the boar turned slightly more than Valeria had expected. The boar once again charged Valeria, but Valeria again managed to dodge the attack, this time striking the boar in the back with her axe. The boar staggered as if it was struggling to hold up its weight, but it once again stood back up, this time letting out a deafening scream before charging Valeria with all its might. Valeria was unable to dodge the attack and held up her axe in a defensive position, but the impact of the boar crashing into her injured her hand and broke the handle of the axe, sending it flying into the air. Injured and having lost her axe, and now armed with nothing but an old machete, Valeria refused to give up. As the boar was preparing for another charge, an old man appeared in the clearing. The boar turned to the old man and charged him. Valeria shouted at him to watch out, but the man easily evaded the boar's attack, and with what Valeria believed to be a cane, he hit the boar in the eye. The boar flinched but lowered its head once again to ready another charge. Valeria once again called out to the old man, telling him to run to her as she extended her arm to help. The man turned to her, and in a gentle tone he told her that she's skilled for her age, but that the boar might be a little tricky for her. The old man taunted the boar, and as the boar began to charge him, Valeria jumped in front of him and thrust her machete at the boar with all her might. The machete had pierced the boar's back, but it was wedged so deep she couldn't pull it out. The boar, now in a rage, once again readied another charge. The old man advised Valeria not to put so much force in her shoulders when she swings a blade. Valeria thanked him for the advice but remarked that there are no weapons left and advised the man to run while she distracts the boar. The man then asked Valeria if she plans to act as a shield and pulled out what Valeria originally believed to be a cane from under his cloak and handed it to her. He handed her a sword of such high quality that Valeria wondered why an old man would have a weapon like this. Valeria drew the sword and the man advised her not to slash the boar but to instead lure it in and stab it between the eyes. As the boar got closer, Valeria thrust the blade forward between the boar's eyes. The boar then fell to the ground and no longer moved. The battle now over, Valeria finally got a good look at the man who helped her. He was an elderly man who appeared to be in his 70s. Valeria then stood over the boar's body, saying that she finally avenged her mother. The old man stood in silence but eventually spoke in a warm tone, telling Valeria that she'd done a good job. Overcome with emotion, Valeria's eyes welled with tears and she couldn't stop crying. Even though she had avenged her mother was still gone. The old man recognized that she'd been bottling up her grief and commented that she's finally allowing herself to grieve. Valeria thanked him for his aid, saying that without his sword she'd be dead. The man replied that it was her skill that allowed her to defeat the boar. He then introduced himself, revealing that his name is Kong Long and that he's originally from a country to the south and that he's passing through on his way to visit an old friend. He told Valeria that he had heard rumours of a beast terrorising the region and that the villagers will be relieved once they learn that the beast has been slain. Valeria smiled at him as Chapter 1 comes to an end. Chapter 2. Valeria arrived back at her village and announced that she had slain the boar, but no one believed her. It wasn't until Kong Long spoke that some of the villagers began to believe she was telling the truth. Some of the young men who were skeptical of their claims went to the eastern clearing to check for themselves. They returned a short while later and confirmed Valeria's story. The villagers began celebrating and Valeria invited Kong Long to her house for a meal to express her gratitude. Kong Long accepted her offer, stating that his trip to visit his friend isn't urgent and that he might stay in the village for some time. He offered to pay for the food that he ate as he didn't want to be a burden by taking advantage of their hospitality. Valeria declined his offer, but Kong Long refused to take no for an answer and Valeria eventually relented. The villagers were intrigued by the old swordsman who told them many stories of his journeys. He happily shared his knowledge with the villagers and even taught the villagers how to read and write. Word soon spread of a great swordsman residing in the village. The chief of the Great Forest Village requested an audience with him, sighing in envy that Kong Long is staying in their village and not his. The village chief asked Kong Long for advice on how to protect the small villages in the area, and Kong Long advised him to collaborate with the other villages to organize a militia. All of the villagers eventually began to call him Old Master out of respect. Valeria told Cain and May that she was only able to defeat the boar because of Kong Long's help. One night, Cain curiously wondered what it would be like if he became a swordsman like Kong Long. May then told Kong Long that their mother told them that their father used to be a swordsman and that he had a sword but they can't find it. Kong Long replied what a shame that is, as he would have loved to have seen the sword. Cain and May excitedly began searching the house for the sword, and prompted by her siblings, Valeria joined in on the search for the sword, and even Kong Long began helping them. May then found something wrapped up and hidden at the back of a closet. Cain and May were excited to find the sword, but Valeria didn't share their enthusiasm. Kong Long asked her why she wasn't excited, and she responded by saying that she knew her father was in the army, but she was curious as to where his armor and shield were. Kong Long told her that she's thinking too much as Cain and May unwrapped the sword. Cain's excitement quickly turned to disappointment as the sword was rusted. He handed the sword to Kong Long, who frowned upon seeing the sword. Kong Long then handed it to Valeria and suggested that she use it. Valeria was surprised by his suggestion. The only reason she picked up the axe and machete was to avenge her mother. She never thought about fighting and she questioned how wielding a sword could help her clear farmland. Kong Long eventually persuaded Valeria to learn swordsmanship, stating that it would be a shame not to make use of her natural talents. Cain and May became excited at the thought of Valeria becoming Kong Long's apprentice. Kong Long then said that he'd hold on to their father's rusted sword for now before wrapping it back up and putting it with the rest of his belongings. Valeria's training began the next day with wooden swords. She was a natural and her skill was increasing by the day. Soon other young villagers began asking to be taught too. Kong Long decided to remain in the village a little longer so he could teach the villagers how to protect themselves. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 begins with a short time skip. Kong Long tells the villagers that he has delayed his trip long enough and that it's time he continued to the capital to visit his friend. Valeria accompanied him to the outskirts of the village where Konglong presented her with her father's sword. He tells her that he sent it to an acquaintance of his to have it restored and that he stayed in the village until the sword was ready. He then asked her to pull out the sword. Valeria drew the sword from its scabbard and the blade shone with a silver light, and Valeria could see her reflection in the blade. Valeria was surprised that her father's old rusty sword could look so remarkable. Konglong told her that the sword is called the Star Sword and encouraged her to continue training. Konglong stared at Valeria and sighed before he spoke his next words. He revealed that he knew Valeria's father and that her father's sword once belonged to him. He drew his own blade, the Conqueror Star Sword, and told Valeria that if she sharpened her skills and her blade, it too will look like his one day. Konglong explained that 50 years ago he was a famed swordsman in his homeland, and that he received an invitation from Michaelan Rugner, the then Emperor of the Scarlet Moon Empire, to come to Gregminster. In Gregminster, Konglong crossed swords with the best the Imperial Army had to offer, but none could match him in battle. After that, he decided to stay in Gregminster and took several Imperial officers under his wing as students. He eventually decided to leave Gregminster when he realised he was being used as a tool in the power struggles of the Imperial elite. But before he left, he bestowed his sword to one of his students, a young man with a kind heart who claimed he wanted to hone his skills to protect people. He then wondered if Valeria's father had left the military or if he was forced out. Konglong goes on to explain that Gale Rugner believed that a foreign swordsman training Imperial soldiers went against the will of the Empire. Hesitating for a moment, Konglong then explained to Valeria that the rust on her father's sword was from blood staining the blade that hadn't been cleaned. He didn't know why her father didn't clean the blade, but said that when you're in the military, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty against your will, and that maybe her father had allowed it to rust so that he'd never have to pick up a sword again. He then remarked that should Valeria ever get involved with the Imperial Army, she'll be able to overcome any challenge as long as she's prepared for it. Valeria replied that there's no way she's joining the army. Konglong responded by telling her that you never know what's going to happen in life. He then smiled at Valeria, telling her that he never had a family of his own, but he's sure her father would be happy to see the person she has become. He continued by telling her to cherish the connections and relationships she forms, that those bonds are passed down through time. Valeria pondered what he meant before replying that she wants to take care of her brother and her sister, as well as the people that she meets. Konglong smiled at her and told her that she'll make some mistakes along the way, but that eventually she'll achieve greatness. Valeria asked him if he really had to go because she still had so much to learn from him. Konglong laughed as he patted her on the shoulder, telling her that she'll be fine without him, and if she's ever in doubt, look to the Star Sword for guidance. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 begins with a 1-year time jump. The War of Succession had just broken out when Gale Rugner called for a trial of disinheritance against his nephew and rightful heir, Barbarossa Rugner. Much of the Empire was under Gale's control, and Barbarossa fled to Panu Yakuta Castle in the Great Forest region with his loyal generals to gather their strength. During the last year, Valeria had joined a militia group that was headquartered in the Great Forest village. Tales of her heroism in defeating the Gold Boar had spread throughout the region. The story varied from a young girl who beat the boar to death with her bare hands to a giant hulking woman wielding a two-handed axe. Kwanda Rosman sent word to the chief of the Great Forest village that he wished to meet with Valeria. Valeria sighed, thinking the only reason he wanted to meet with her was due to those silly rumours. Valeria was hesitant to meet with him as she didn't have a good impression of the Imperial Army due to her father's past and the stories told to her by Konglong, but she reluctantly agreed to the meeting to avoid spoiling the mood of the banquet that was due to be held in the village. Valeria arrived shortly after the banquet had begun and the village chief escorted her to Kwanda. Kwanda grinned while saying he had heard that Valeria was a barbarian who wields dual axes and asking how could this young girl standing before him defeat a boar with those thin arms. Valeria smiled, stating that no matter how good she is, there's no way she could do it with her bare hands as she grit her teeth and held up her fists. Valeria's response made Kwanda laugh. He then offered her a reward for her service in ridding the local villages of the boar that plagued them. He asked her if there was anything she wanted, and Valeria shook her head in rejection, stating that she killed the boar to avenge her mother's death and for no other reason. Kwanda admired her reluctance to accept a reward, but once again offered her a reward, but this time for her devotion to her mother. Valeria once again rejected Kwanda's offer, stating that she failed her mother, and if she accepts a reward for killing the boar, then she can't devote the kill to her mother. Kwanda then asked her if she was telling him that she doesn't need anything. Valeria once again rejected him by telling him she doesn't want anything. The village chief was angry at Valeria's attitude and apologized to Kwanda for her stubbornness. Kwanda, who is known for being quite stubborn himself, burst out laughing as he was impressed by Valeria's attitude. He then asked Valeria if she had ever heard the story of a legendary general from the early days of the Scarlet Moon Empire known as the Tiger General. Valeria replied that she had never heard the story before and asked Kwanda to tell her the tale. Kwanda began to tell the tale of how when the Tiger General was young, his mother was eaten by a tiger and he spent 3 years hunting the tiger to avenge his mother's death. He eventually found the tiger and shot an arrow at it, but when he went to check if the tiger was dead, he realized it was not a tiger, but a rock, and his arrow struck the rock with such force that it couldn't be pulled out. The strength of that arrow is said to represent the man's will. Kwanda then commented that Valeria's devotion to her mother is comparable to that of the Tiger General. Valeria was lost for words. Kwanda was a very different man from what she had imagined he would be. Kwanda then commented that he wished more of his subordinates were like Valeria. He then explained the ill deeds of Gale Rugner and how Barbarossa is the true emperor and that they need to bring justice to the world. Kwanda appealed to Valeria to join his army, but before giving him an answer, Valeria asked him why he believes Barbarossa is the right choice to lead the country. Kwanda explained to her how Gale and his army are plundering the nation and leaving ruin everywhere they go. He continued by explaining that if nothing is done to stop Gale, the war will eventually come to the Great Forest and people all over the country will suffer as the land becomes plagued with bandits. Valeria then knelt before Kwanda, volunteering to join his army. A servant then brought Kwanda a goblet filled with fruit juice. The oath is normally drank with alcohol, but as she's still a child, fruit juice will have to suffice. She can't have a sip of wine, but you'll gladly send her to the front lines on a battlefield as a child soldier? 3 days later, Kwanda's army left the village to return to Panu Yakuta Castle to meet with Barbarossa. In addition to the villagers recruited in the Great Forest village, dozens of young men and women from the surrounding villages had enlisted. Volunteers were given a lump sum of potch in exchange for their service, and Valeria gave hers to her siblings Cain and May. The two were crying and begging Valeria not to leave them, but Valeria vowed to stop the war to protect the village so that they can live in peace. The story comes to an end as Valeria left the village, remembering Kong Long and wondering if he knew all along that she'd one day join the Imperial Army. That's it for Valeria's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled The Star Sword's Radiance from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 2 that released in Japan in 2001. If there are any other character short stories you want me to cover, let me know in the comments below. You can find a list of all characters who receive short stories in the pinned comment. Or if there are any other Suikoden related topics or non-related Suikoden topics you want me to make videos on, do let me know. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.